So the acceleration, lots of people talk now about the acceleration of technology, but evolution gives us a model and a way to explain why and how that occurs. If you look at the origin of life as occurring 3.8 billion years ago, Luca, another billion years later, and then another billion years later, before we got to eukaryotic cells, which are the foundation for all the multicellular creatures on Earth today, why did it take? Well, first of all, we need to look at ourselves. We've only been here for 2.5 million years. So there's this enormous acceleration of evolution. And the question is, what was going on for the 2 billion years that it took to go from bacterial cells to eukaryotic cells? The theory of facilitated variation, developed by Professor Mark Kirschner, founder, chair of the Department of Systems Biology at Harvard, and his collaborator John Gearhart at UC Berkeley in molecular biology, brings together two separated strands. The Evo strand of the people who've been looking at a macro level at the dynamics of evolution and trying to understand that, and the cell biologists, molecular biologists, and biochemists who've been looking at a micro level, and the two strands haven't been communicating that much with each other. And what Kirschner says is we need to bring those two strands back together because actually the secret lies in cell biology. And again, I'm vastly oversimplifying just to make a point here, but the significant point that I want to make about this is that, of course, they've drawn together, the typical biologist picks an organism and does very specialized research on that one organism, and so there's this great diversity of research, and there is need for conceptual thinkers who can pull that together into a theory as Kirschner and Gerhardt have. And the significance of what they suggest in a broader sense is that we have tended to focus on the product of evolution. Evolution produces a product which survives, is either fit and survives or not. And their theory suggests that we should look much more closely at process in evolution, and that evolution was not only producing products, but evolving processes, and conserved core processes enabled evolution to accelerate faster and faster and faster. So when cell signaling and cell replication and metabolism were developed, these processes were conserved and transmitted forward. So moving on to design, lots of study of the Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Island, and most of those studies initially suggest that Darwinism is the sole explanation for how evolution advanced. But as you review those studies, there's some chinks in the argument, so that you start to ask, supposing you were a big, beautiful, very orange bird with wonderfully long legs, and the predator came at you, and you always froze, despite your lousy camouflage, you probably wouldn't survive. Or you were a little tiny bird with little short legs and fabulous camouflage, and you always decided to run. Those bad decisions would affect your survivability. And so as you look at these studies, you realize that behavior plays a very important part in evolution. So this question of life as self-designing was the great complexity of life on Earth, produced solely through random variation, mutation, and environmental selection, or were other factors at work? Now, I'm going to leave the I out of it. That has been a big study. That's one of those paths that I could go down that would lead to lots of detail. And, of course, the intelligent designers have grabbed hold of it, but many, many other thinkers have thought about it as well. And how does a complex structure like an eye evolve? Richard Dawkins would say it's just plain simple, just little incremental changes. But there are lots of questions raised about that. And so this notion that evolution simply proceeds through repeated rolls of the dice and the environment choosing has potential limitations. I want to suggest that this question, beyond Darwinism versus intelligent design, is there a third option, has an answer, and that the answer is yes. There's some very hard questions brought up in in asking about this. Why does the arrow of evolution point toward complexity? What's the role of design in evolution? The role of performance? The role of pattern recognition in evolving intelligence? And what are the principles of evolution, and how are they coupled to principles of design? So this brings us to this split between the is world that science purports to study, the actual, what is, and engineers purport to be accurate, and the as world, or the perceived world. And any chess player in this group would immediately note that it's not just the patterns on the chessboard that determine the outcome of the game. It's the strategic patterns recognized in the mind of the player that will determine the outcome of the game. So I want to quote that, the assumption is that the as world is something that flaky artists are concerned about, but not serious science and engineering. And I want to quote mathematician Stanislaw Ulam speaking to his good friend John von Neumann, he said, "What makes you so sure that mathematical logic corresponds to the way we think? The time has come to enrich formal logic by adding to it some other fundamental notions. What is it that you see when you see? You see an object as a key. You see some sheets of paper as a book. It is the word as that must be mathematically formalized, on a par with connectives and, or, implies, and not, that have already been accepted into formal logic." And of course, those computer scientists in the room would remember Vannevar Bush's classic, "As We May Think," as he was working in 1945 on analog computing and his ideas for the MEMEX. And so I want to suggest that there is a parallel. We easily accept that there's the left brain and the right brain in these two complementary modes of thinking. I want to suggest, and wouldn't it be logical to believe, that there is a similar complementarity in a full description of evolution. And to quote the eloquent Sir Charles Sherrington, "Between the perceiving mind and the perceived world, is there nothing in common? We call them disparate and incommensurable. Nature in evolving us makes them two parts of one mind, and that one mind is our own. We are the tie between them. Perhaps that is why we exist." So there's the is world, which studies what is actual, the as world, and what is perceived. Is studies the competition dynamic, as the collaborative dynamic. Is the survival of the fittest, as utility and performance. Is objects and genetics, as process and behavior. The is world, assessment of the fittest objects. The as world, pattern recognition of possibility. The is world, design with a capital D, top down. The as world, design as self-organization.